The gun was already pressed against Rebecca Bancroft's ribs when she made the decision that would change everything. She stood in the dusty main corridor of the Easton Ranch house, the late afternoon sun bleeding orange through the narrow windows, and she looked at the man she had been sent to destroy. Elias Easton stood across the room with his back to her, pouring 2 fingers of whiskey into a glass tumbler, completely unaware that 3 men were riding hard toward his property at that very moment, carrying dynamite, carrying rifles, and carrying orders to burn everything he had built to the ground. She had 48 hours to complete her assignment. 48 hours to charm him, to seduce him, to keep his eyes on her instead of on the horizon. 48 hours to make sure Elias Easton was so thoroughly distracted by the pretty woman his enemies had placed in his path that he would never see the ambush coming until it was far too late. She had arrived with a lie sewn into every word of her cover story. She had arrived with instructions memorized and a desperate need for the payment she had been promised. She had arrived knowing full well what men like Gerald Holt were capable of, and what they would do to her if she failed them. But somewhere between the moment Elias Easton had opened his front door and looked at her with those careful, storm-gray eyes, not suspicious, not cruel, just quietly watchful, as though the world had taught him to read people slowly and carefully, something had cracked open inside her chest. He had not leered at her. He had not grabbed her arm or sneered at her circumstances. He had simply said, "You look like you have been riding in the heat for too long. Come inside and I will pour you some water." And then he had done exactly that, and then he had asked her 3 questions about herself and actually listened to every answer. Nobody had listened to Rebecca Bancroft in a very long time. So now, with the sun dropping lower and the clock in her skull ticking louder, she made the only choice she could live with. "Mr. Easton," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she had any right to expect. He turned from the window with the glass in his hand, one dark eyebrow raised. "There is something I have to tell you," Rebecca said, "and I need you to hear all of it before you say a word, because your life depends on understanding every piece of it." Elias set the glass down on the oak table very slowly, the way a man sets something down when his hands need to stay free. His eyes narrowed, not with anger, not yet, but with the sharp focus of a man who had spent years reading the land for signs of trouble and had just spotted something on the horizon. "Then talk," he said quietly. "I am listening." And so she told him everything. 3 weeks earlier, Rebecca Bancroft had been sitting in the back corner of the Dusty Rose Saloon in the town of Coldwater, Texas, counting her last $2 and trying to figure out how far $2 would take a 24-year-old woman with no family, no prospects, and a very short list of marketable skills. The year was 1878, and Coldwater was the kind of town that had grown up fast around a cattle route and hadn't bothered to grow a conscience along with it. The saloon was busy on a Thursday night, which told you something about the character of the place. Rebecca was not one of the girls who worked the floor for tips. She had come in because it was the only establishment on the main street that would serve a woman alone without making a production of it, and because the man behind the bar, Old Pete, had once known her father and occasionally let her have a bowl of the kitchen stew without charging. She had been in Coldwater for 6 weeks, having come down from Amarillo after the family she had worked for as a housekeeper had packed up and moved to Kansas City without offering to take her along. Before that, she had spent 2 years as a seamstress's assistant in Amarillo. Before that, she had spent a year teaching school in a one-room schoolhouse in a settlement that had dried up when the well did. Her whole life had been a series of useful positions that disappeared when they were no longer needed, and she was running out of places to land. She was not a woman given to self-pity. She had dark brown hair that she kept pinned severely because it was easier to keep clean that way. Eyes the color of good river mud that people sometimes called amber when they were being generous, and a practical intelligence that she had learned early to keep mostly hidden, because the world tended not to know what to do with a practically intelligent woman who had no money. She was sitting with her stew and her $2, mentally composing a letter to a distant aunt in Missouri who almost certainly would not respond, when Gerald Holt sat down across from her without asking. Gerald Holt was 43 years old, wide through the shoulders, with a well-trimmed mustache that he clearly spent time on and small dark eyes that moved constantly, cataloging everyone in the room. He wore a good coat, the kind that said money without shouting it, and he smelled of bay rum and something underneath it that Rebecca had no name for but instinctively disliked. "Miss Bancroft," he said, as though they had already been introduced, which they had not. "You have me at a disadvantage," she said. Gerald Holt. He said it the way men say names when they expect to be recognized. When she simply looked at him steadily, something flickered behind his eyes. "I am a land agent operating out of Abilene. I have interests in this region." "I am sure you do," she said, and went back to her stew. "I have a proposition for you," he said, "a paying proposition." Rebecca put down her spoon. "What kind of proposition?" He leaned forward and folded his hands on the table, which was somehow worse than if he had spread them wide. "The kind that requires a woman of particular qualities: intelligence, composure, the ability to present herself well and gain a man's trust quickly." She studied him. "And what would this woman be gaining this man's trust for?" Holt smiled, and it did not reach the small dark eyes. "There is a rancher north of here by about 40 miles. Name of Elias Easton. He owns the Crossbar Ranch, which sits directly on top of the most valuable stretch of grazing land in this part of Texas. He has refused, repeatedly and rudely, to sell that land to a consortium I represent. My clients have become impatient." He paused. "I need someone to visit Mr. Easton under a plausible pretext, perhaps as a traveler seeking temporary work. Something that will get her inside his household for a few days." "And do what?" Rebecca said flatly. "Keep him occupied," Holt said. "Keep his attention inside the house and away from the ranch perimeter. My clients have certain plans that require his distraction for approximately 2 days." Rebecca looked at him for a long, quiet moment. "You want me to seduce a man so your associates can rob him blind or burn him out?" Holt's expression did not change. "I want you to be present and charming. What you choose to do with that presence is entirely your own business. And if I say no—" He reached into his coat pocket and set a folded paper on the table. $200, he said. "Half when you agree, half when the job is complete and my associates confirm you were where you were supposed to be." $200. Rebecca did not touch the paper. She thought about her $2. She thought about the aunt in Missouri. She thought about the thin mattress she was sleeping on in a rented room above a dry goods store where the landlady already had her eye on Rebecca's one remaining good pair of boots as collateral for the next week's rent. She thought about the rancher she had never met and what 2 days of distraction might cost him. "What exactly are your associates planning to do?" she asked carefully. "That is not your concern," Holt said. "I will not participate in murder," she said. Something shifted in his face too quickly for her to read it fully. "Nobody is planning to kill anyone," he said smoothly. "Property can be replaced. Land can be negotiated, but Mr. Easton has been unreasonable, and sometimes unreasonable men need a reminder that the world is larger than their fence lines." It was a lie. She was almost certain it was a lie. But she was also almost certain that if she stood up and walked away from this table, Gerald Holt would simply find someone else, someone with fewer qualms or more desperation, and Elias Easton would still find himself in whatever trap was being laid for him. And she had no proof. She had no authority. She had no way to warn a man she had never met about a plan she only half understood, not without putting herself squarely in Holt's line of sight as a problem to be solved. She thought for a long time. Then she reached out and took the folded paper. "I want payment in coin," she said. "Not a note. Coin." Holt smiled his non-smile. "Naturally." She spent 2 days in Coldwater after that, watching Holt's movements without being obvious about it, collecting small pieces of information the way a woman who has learned to watch quietly can collect them. She learned the names of two of the men Holt was meeting with in the back rooms of the saloon. She learned that one of them, a man called Dix Barlow, had a history of burning buildings. She learned that Holt's consortium was not a legal land brokerage firm at all but a front for a group of investors who were not above using violence to clear obstacles from their path. She also learned from old Pete behind the bar, who had grown up in the region, that Elias Easton had owned the Crossbar Ranch for 12 years, having built it from nothing after coming back from the war, that he employed 8 ranch hands and had a reputation for paying fair wages and treating his people decently, and that he had no family except a younger sister who had married and moved to San Antonio. None of that changed the plan she had already formed, which was not Gerald Holt's plan at all. She took the $100 advance in coin, which felt heavier in her coat pocket than any amount of money had a right to feel, and she rode north. The Crossbar Ranch announced itself to a traveler long before the house came into view. The fence lines were straight and solid, the kind of fence a man builds when he intends to stay. The pasture on either side was thick with good grass, and the cattle she could see in the distance were healthy animals, well tended and unhurried. A small creek ran alongside the main track, lined with cottonwood trees that offered shade and the sound of moving water, and even in the dry heat of a Texas summer afternoon, the place had a feeling of order, of something carefully made and stubbornly maintained. Rebecca rode her hired horse up to the main house and dismounted at the hitching post, and before she had fully gathered herself to approach the front door, it opened. Elias Easton was not what she had expected, and she had known, in the abstract way of someone preparing for an encounter, that she should have no expectations at all. He was tall, well over 6 feet, and lean in the way of men who work hard outdoors, with wide shoulders and hands that were rough and scarred in the specific ways that ranch work leaves its marks. He was perhaps 35, with dark hair worn short and a jaw that carried 2 days of dark stubble, and his eyes, when they met hers, were the kind of gray that shifts like a sky before rain. He wore a plain cotton shirt, work trousers and suspenders, and he had clearly just come in from some outdoor task because there was dust on his boots and a faint line of sweat at his collar. He looked at her horse, which was winded from the ride. He looked at her coat, which had dust on it from 40 miles of road. He looked at her face, which she had schooled into the expression of a woman who had been traveling hard and was approaching a stranger's door with the particular combination of dignity and necessity that circumstance required. "You look like you have been riding in the heat for too long," he said. "Come inside and I will pour you some water." And just like that, the first layer of Rebecca's prepared story dissolved completely, because she had expected suspicion, or at minimum a question, and what she got instead was simple human decency, offered without performance or condition. She followed him inside, and he poured the water, and he asked her 3 questions: where she had come from, where she was headed, and whether she had eaten, and he listened to the answers with the full attention of a man who was not thinking about anything else while she spoke. She told him she had come from Coldwater, looking for work. She told him she was a capable housekeeper and cook and had experience with ranch administration, keeping books and correspondence. She told him she would work for room and board for a trial period if he had anything to offer. Every word of it was true. That was the thing she had decided, on the long ride north. She would not use a single lie she did not absolutely have to use. She would tell him true things about herself. She would be exactly who she was. And then, when she had assessed the situation more fully and understood what she was up against, she would tell him the rest of it. She had not expected it to happen within the first 2 hours of her arrival, but she had not expected, either, the way he had listened. And she had not expected the way the house felt clean and spare and honest, a working man's house without pretension, with a good wood stove in the kitchen and a row of books on a shelf in the sitting room that surprised her into commenting on them, and the surprise in his face when she named 2 of the authors and said she had read their work. "You read Thoreau," he said, as if testing the statement. "Walden," she said. I thought it was beautiful and also somewhat impractical, but I held both those things at the same time without too much trouble. Something had shifted in his expression then, something that was not quite a smile but was in the neighborhood of one. "I have thought the exact same thing every time I read it," he said, "which is 3 times now." She had felt it then, the thing she had been trying not to feel since she rode onto the property, the particular warmth that comes from being genuinely seen by someone who had no obligation to look at you carefully at all. It was a dangerous feeling. It was the kind of feeling that could compromise her judgment if she allowed it to. She had not allowed it to. She had spent the afternoon working, actually working, helping his housekeeper Marta, who was a stout and cheerful Mexican woman of 50 who clearly ran the domestic side of the ranch with competent authority, to prepare the evening meal. She had helped organize a stack of correspondence on the office desk. She had noticed in the office a land survey map tacked to the wall, with a red ink line drawn around the crossbar's boundary and a question mark in pencil in the lower corner, which told her something about the nature of Holt's interest that she had not fully understood before. The crossbar's southwest pasture bordered a waterway. Not just any waterway, but what appeared, from the survey map, to be the headwaters of a seasonal creek that fed into the primary grazing region for 3 counties. Whoever controlled the crossbar controlled the water access. That was what Holt's consortium was after. Not just the land, the water rights. That evening, sitting at the supper table with Elias Easton and 2 of his ranch hands, a young man named Tommy and an older weathered man everyone called Court, eating good beef stew and fresh bread, she had made her decision with the certainty of someone who has looked at a problem from every angle and found only one answer that she could live with. She would tell him. She would tell him everything she knew and let him decide what to do with it. And whatever came afterward, whether he threw her off the property, whether he went to the sheriff, whether Holt's men found out she had betrayed the assignment, she would face it. She owed him that. Not because she loved him. She was careful to tell herself this firmly. Not because of one afternoon's kindness and a conversation about Thoreau, but because no amount of desperation was worth what she would become if she let a decent man walk into a trap she knew about and said nothing. So when the supper dishes were cleared and the ranch hands had gone back to the bunkhouse and Elias had poured himself that glass of whiskey, she had followed him into the sitting room and said the words that started this whole story. "Mr. Easton, there is something I have to tell you." And now she was telling him. She told him everything. Gerald Holt's name, the saloon meeting, the $100 she had taken, and the 100 more she was supposed to collect. Dix Barlow and the other man whose name she had learned, a wiry man from Abilene called Frank Sutter, who had a reputation for being the kind of person who did the things others would not. The 2 days. The dynamite she had heard mentioned. The plan to use her presence as cover for whatever they intended to do. She told him all of it without flinching, keeping her voice steady and her eyes on his face, watching the expressions move through those storm-gray eyes in rapid succession: shock, calculation, anger, something harder and more controlled. And when she finished, there was a silence in the room that felt like the moment before a storm breaks. "You took the money," Elias said. His voice was very quiet. "Yes. You rode up here intending to be exactly what they wanted you to be." "I rode up here intending to tell you what I just told you," she said. "The other part was a means of getting close enough to do that without Holt deciding I was a loose end before I got here." "That is either the most complicated kind of honesty I have ever heard or the most complicated kind of lie," he said. "I know," she said. "I cannot prove which one it is. You will have to judge for yourself." He stood very still. Then he walked to the window and looked out at the darkening land, and she could see the muscle working in his jaw, and she waited with her hands folded in her lap and her heart making a good deal more noise in her chest than she would have liked. 2 days, he said finally. "That is what he told me, and he said his associates would confirm I was present and occupied." So there will be someone watching the house, or at minimum someone who will expect word that you were not alarmed. How many men? I heard 3 named. There may be more. He turned from the window, and his expression had settled into something she had not seen yet on his face, not the warmth of the afternoon or the careful watchfulness of their first meeting, but the particular stillness of a man who has spent years dealing with hard situations and has learned to think clearly when most people would panic. "You could have just left," he said. "You could have taken the $100 and ridden in the opposite direction." "Yes," she said. "Why didn't you?" The honest answer was complex and contained things she was not ready to say, so she gave him the part of the honest answer that was simplest. "Because you listened to me," she said. "Because you poured me water and asked me 3 questions and actually heard the answers. That is not a small thing, Mr. Easton. For some people that is not a thing they encounter very often." He looked at her for a long time. Then he sat down in the armchair across from the sofa where she was sitting, leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and said, "All right, then let us figure out what we are going to do." What they decided to do was this. Rebecca would remain at the ranch, exactly as Holt expected. She would be visible and present, and if Holt had men watching the road, they would see no alarm, no unusual activity, nothing to suggest that Elias Easton was anything other than pleasantly distracted by his new houseguest. Meanwhile, Elias would send word to his ranch hands without making it obvious that anything had changed. He had 8 men total, 2 of whom, Court and a big quiet man named Abel, had prior experience with exactly this kind of trouble. He would also send Tommy, his youngest hand but the fastest rider, into the town of Harker's Creek, which was closer than Coldwater, with a message for the county sheriff. This plan had one significant weakness, which was that nobody knew for certain when Holt's men would move, or from which direction, or precisely what they were planning. Dynamite suggested the outbuildings, the barn, the water tower, the storage facilities, rather than the house itself. Destroying a man's infrastructure while leaving him personally unharmed would be Holt's preferred approach, Rebecca guessed, because Holt was the kind of man who calculated consequences, and a dead rancher attracted more official attention than a burned barn. But guessing was not the same as knowing. They talked for 2 hours that night, sitting across from each other in the sitting room while the lamp burned low, and at some point the conversation shifted from tactics to the other things. The way conversations do when 2 people are genuinely thinking together in the same direction about something that matters. Elias told her about the water rights without her having to mention the survey map. He knew Holt's consortium had designs on them. He had been approached 3 times in the past year, twice by mail and once by a lawyer who arrived in person and left empty-handed and visibly frustrated. He had known something was coming. He had not known how or when. "My father built this ranch," he said, and for the first time that evening his voice carried something other than controlled practicality. "He came to Texas from Virginia in 1849 when I was 6 years old. He spent 20 years on this land. He died on this land." He paused. "I have had men try to take it from me before. Different men, different methods. I am still here." "How?" she asked. "By not underestimating the people who come after you," he said. "And by having people around you that you trust." He said that last part looking directly at her, and the implication of it was not lost on Rebecca, though neither of them chose to name it. She slept that night in the small bedroom Marta had prepared for her, which was clean and had a real mattress and a window that looked out over the east pasture, and she lay awake for a long time listening to the night sounds of the ranch, the cattle in the distance, the wind in the cottonwoods along the creek, and thinking about the fact that she had, in the space of a single evening, gone from being a woman with a secret and a plan to being a woman who had given away the secret, and was now fully committed to a plan she had not designed and could not fully control. It should have frightened her more than it did. The next morning was clear and dry, with a high blue sky and the particular sharp quality of a Texas summer morning before the heat rose. Rebecca was up before Marta, which earned her an approving look from the older woman when she appeared in the kitchen. She made coffee and biscuits and tried not to show that she had slept badly. Elias came in from his early rounds looking freshly purposeful in a way she had not seen the previous afternoon, which told her he had also spent the night thinking rather than sleeping. He sat at the table with his coffee and said quietly, so Marta could not hear from the next room, that Tommy had ridden before dawn and should reach Harker's Creek by mid-morning. He had also spoken to Court and Abel. The other 5 ranch hands had been quietly repositioned in ways that would look normal to anyone watching from outside the property. Additional fence checking, some cattle movement near the south pasture, but that would put his most capable men in better defensive positions. "And you," he said, glancing at her over his coffee cup. "I am exactly where Holt expects me to be," she said, "keeping you occupied." Something in his expression shifted, a subtle thing, not quite amusement but something in that territory. "You are doing an effective job of it," he said, and then looked immediately out the window as if he had not said it, which made Rebecca look down at her coffee for the same reason. The day passed with a tension beneath it that felt like the tightening of a rope. Rebecca maintained her domestic activities with a focus that would have impressed her old employer in Amarillo. She helped Marta with the morning tasks, organized 3 months of ranch correspondence that had been piling up on Elias' desk, mended a curtain in the kitchen, and in the afternoon sat on the porch with a piece of sewing because a woman sitting on a porch sewing was the most conspicuously unthreatening image she could project to anyone watching the house. Elias came and went throughout the day, doing his regular work with enough normalcy to satisfy an observer, but pausing at intervals to exchange a word with her, always in a quiet voice, always with that focused watchfulness in his eyes that told her he was tracking 15 things at once. At one point mid-afternoon, he sat down on the porch step below where she was sitting and tilted his hat back and looked at the horizon for a while without speaking, and it was such a natural thing, such a comfortable shared silence, that Rebecca had to remind herself it was the second day she had known this man. "Tell me about yourself," he said, not looking at her. "Not the practical parts." "You have already told me the practical parts." She paused in her sewing. "What sort of parts do you want?" "The part where you ended up at old Pete's bar in Coldwater with $2 and a proposition from a man like Gerald Holt," he said, and now he did look at her, and there was nothing cruel in it, nothing prying, just the same quality of attention she had noticed from the very beginning. So she told him. She told him about the schoolhouse in the dried-up settlement and the seamstress in Amarillo, and the family that had moved to Kansas City and the $2. And further back than that, about growing up in Oklahoma Territory, a minister's daughter, with a father who believed fiercely in education, and a mother who had died of fever when Rebecca was 11. And a childhood that had given her books and values, and very little else in the way of practical protection against a world that was not particularly interested in what a woman could think or read. He listened without interrupting, which she had already learned was how he listened to everything. "You should have been a lawyer," he said when she finished, "or an architect, something that required a person to understand structure and think several moves ahead. Women are not admitted to those professions," she said. "No," he said, "that is a significant injustice." She looked at him, genuinely startled by the straightforwardness of that statement. Most men of her acquaintance would have softened it or qualified it or pretended the conversation had not gone there. He simply said it and then turned to look back at the horizon as if he had said nothing extraordinary. "What about you?" she said. "You mentioned your father. Was there ever did you have?" She stopped, feeling suddenly that she was venturing somewhere she had not been invited. "A wife," he said. "I should not have asked." "It is not a secret." He was quiet for a moment. "There was a woman, Sarah. We were going to be married in 1867. She died of cholera that summer in the epidemic that came through this region. She was 22. He paused. "I have not been particularly inclined toward that kind of vulnerability since then." "I understand that," Rebecca said quietly. He looked at her again, and this time the look lasted longer than the others, and something in it was different from watchfulness. Something more open, more uncertain, which on his controlled face was more remarkable than the directness had been. He looked away before she did, which also seemed remarkable. That evening, one of the exterior ranch hands came in at dusk to report that there had been movement on the southwest road. 3 riders had been seen at a distance, moving slowly, the kind of movement that suggested observation rather than travel. Court had counted them from the ridge above the south pasture. They were being watched. Elias received this information with complete steadiness. He adjusted the arrangements he had made. He positioned Abel and 2 other hands near the barn, where they would not be visible from the road. He sent word to Court to hold the ridge position. He loaded both his rifles, a Winchester repeating rifle and an older Springfield, and set them within easy reach but out of sight in the office. And then he came back to the supper table and ate the meal Marta had prepared with the same quiet focus as every other thing he did. Rebecca watched him across the table and thought, with a clarity that frightened her, that this was the most genuinely capable person she had ever met, not because of any single dramatic thing, but because of the comprehensive and unhurried way he dealt with everything that came at him, the way a good structure bears weight not by rigidity, but by integrity of design. She was well past the point of pretending this feeling was anything other than what it was. She was simply not sure what to do with it, given the circumstances. After supper, while Marta was clearing up, Elias stood and said to Rebecca in a low voice, "Come to the office. I want to go over the survey map with you." In the office, with the door half closed and the lamp turned low, he spread the survey map on the desk and pointed out the southwest corner of the property in a way that made the full picture clear. The water rights were not just significant, they were decisive. The consortium that Holt represented had been buying up adjacent land for 2 years. If they could break Elias' hold on the Crossbar, they would control water access for half the county and be in a position to charge every downstream rancher and farmer for the privilege of existing. "This is not personal," Elias said, "or not only personal. If they succeed here, there are at least 6 other families downstream who will feel it within a year. Then the sheriff from Harker's Creek needs to understand the full scope of it," Rebecca said, "not just the immediate threat to your property. Tommy should have delivered the message by now. Sheriff Briggs is not a man who moves slowly when he has reason to move." He looked at her. "You helped me understand it more completely. The survey detail you noticed yesterday." "It was the question mark in pencil," she said. "Someone had been adding their own notation to your map. Marta, maybe, or someone who had access to your office." He stilled. "Marta has been with me for 10 years, he said. I am not saying Marta," Rebecca said quickly. "I am saying someone who had access to the office. That might be any of your hands. It might be someone who visited the ranch in the past months. It might be someone you have no reason to suspect." He stood very still for a long moment. "Frank Sutter," he said slowly. "You said that was one of Holt's men." "Yes. There was a man who stopped here 6 weeks ago, said he was a government land surveyor doing routine updates. I led him into the office to check the official plot documents. His jaw set. I never saw him again after that." "Then he left you something," Rebecca said. "And he may have told Holt's men things about the property layout that I was not aware he knew." They looked at each other across the map, and the significance of this realization settled between them like a stone dropping into still water. "They know where the barn sits in relation to the water tower," Elias said. "They know the layout of the outbuildings. They know where my hands sleep." "Then we need to move some of them," Rebecca said immediately. "Tonight. Right now." He was already moving toward the door. The next hour was quiet and controlled, and very purposeful. Elias reorganized the sleeping arrangements in the bunkhouse. Not all of them, just enough to disrupt the specific positions a man with knowledge of the layout would expect to find. Abel and Court moved to positions near the water tower rather than the barn. The two remaining hands who had not been in previous defensive positions were repositioned near the north pasture fence, which was the direction the three riders had most recently been observed approaching from. Through all of this, Rebecca remained at the house, because that was where she was supposed to be, and moving her would signal alarm. She sat in the sitting room with a book open in her lap that she was not reading, and she listened to the night sounds with the particular intensity of a person waiting for something they cannot name precisely but can feel approaching. Elias came back to the house at 10 o'clock. He sat across from her in the armchair, and for a while neither of them spoke, and the fire in the stove cast orange light across the room, and the night outside the windows was very dark. "I want to ask you something," Elias said. "Ask." "When Holt first approached you, before you decided what you were going to do, what made it a real decision for you? What was the thing that could have gone either way?" Rebecca thought about this carefully because it deserved a careful answer. "The $200, she said honestly. That was a real temptation. Not because I wanted to be wealthy, because that amount would have given me enough breathing room to make a real choice about what came next. To not be someone who has to take whatever is offered because there is no alternative." She paused. "The decision that it was not worth it was made before I arrived here. But I want to be honest with you that it was a genuine decision, not an easy one." "I appreciate that," he said. "The honest version. I said something to you last night," she continued. "That you had listened to me and asked me questions, and that was why I told you. That was true, but it was not the whole truth. The whole truth is that I had already decided before I arrived here. The listening mattered because it confirmed that the decision was right. But the decision came from something else." "Which was?" She met his eyes. "I have spent a great deal of my life in positions where I was used as a convenient tool, a housekeeper, a teacher, a seamstress's assistant, and always discarded when I was no longer convenient. I had been offered the chance to do the same thing to someone else, and I found that I could not do it. I could not be the kind of person who uses another person as a means to an end, regardless of what I was paid." She paused. "That is the more complete, honest version." The fire cracked and settled. Outside, somewhere in the darkness, a coyote called and was answered from a distance. "Rebecca," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name, and it landed with a weight she had not fully anticipated. "Yes. I am glad you came here." She looked at him for a long moment. This careful, steady man with his storm-gray eyes and his rough hands and his books and his grief still living quietly in him from 1867, and she felt something she had not felt in years, not the complicated warmth of being seen, which she had felt yesterday, but something simpler and deeper and more dangerous. "So am I," she said. "The attack came at 3 in the morning, not the way they had expected it. Not dynamite at the barn or rifles from the south pasture. It came as fire, 2 men with torches approaching the water tower from the northeast, the one direction that had been least closely watched, moving in the dark between the cottonwood trees along the creek, where a watcher on the ridge would not easily see them. It was Abel who first saw them, not from any assigned position, but because Abel had gone to refill his canteen at the creek and was crossing back when the torchlight appeared in the trees. He shouted once, loud enough to wake the whole ranch, and the situation accelerated immediately into exactly the kind of controlled chaos that Elias had spent the day preparing for. Rebecca heard the shout from inside the house and was on her feet before the sound fully registered. She went to the office, not to the door, because she had already decided earlier in the evening that if something happened in the night, she would go to the office and position herself near the rifle that Elias had told her was accessible, the Springfield, which she had never fired but knew in principle how to operate, because her father had taught her the basics of firearms the same way he had taught her Thoreau, on the grounds that a woman alone in the world needed to understand both. She did not need to use it, as it turned out. Elias and Court reached the creek in time to intercept the 2 torch carriers before they got close enough to the tower to do real damage. There was a struggle in the dark at the tree line, rough and brief, and then 2 men were disarmed and on the ground, and it was over before Rebecca had fully oriented herself to the situation. The third rider, who had been positioned on the northeast road as a lookout, heard the shouting and ran rather than fought. Court's horse was saddled from the evening's preparations, and Court rode hard and brought the man back before he had covered 2 miles. All 3 of Holt's men were secured in the ranch's storage building by 3:30 in the morning, which was when Rebecca finally put the Springfield down and walked out onto the porch. Elias was standing in the yard between the house and the water tower, talking to Abel and one other hand. His shirt was torn at the shoulder, and there was a scrape on his jaw from the struggle in the trees, but he was standing straight, and his voice was level, and everything about him communicated a man who had done exactly what he set out to do and knew it. He looked over at her on the porch, and even in the dark at that distance she could read the look, checking, instinctive, confirming that she was all right. She nodded once. He held her gaze for a moment, then turned back to Abel. The sheriff from Harker's Creek arrived the following morning at about 9 o'clock, riding hard with 2 deputies, having received Tommy's message and spent the night preparing. Sheriff Briggs was a large, capable-looking man in his 50s, who had the worn authority of someone who had been doing his job in hard country for a long time. He listened to Elias' account and Rebecca's account, and the account of the 3 captured men, 2 of whom were saying very little, and one of whom had apparently decided that cooperation was in his immediate interest. The cooperating man's information confirmed everything Rebecca had told Elias, and added several additional pieces about Holt's consortium and its members and the broader plan for the water rights. It was enough, Sheriff Briggs said, to warrant riding to Coldwater and finding Gerald Holt before he had a chance to understand that his plan had failed. Briggs took the 3 men with him and left 1 deputy at the ranch. He sent a 2nd deputy ahead toward Coldwater and rode after him within the hour. He returned that evening with Gerald Holt in custody, which was faster than anyone had expected, but which apparently spoke to the fact that Holt had been waiting for confirmation of success from his men, and had not yet understood that the opposite had occurred. Holt's small dark eyes found Rebecca in the yard as the sheriff's party arrived, and the look on his face in that moment was one she had anticipated and was prepared for, not anger exactly, but the cold, calculating reassessment of a man who has recognized that a piece he believed to be in his control was operating independently. "You will regret this, Miss Bancroft," he said, in the quiet way of men who say things they mean. "I regret a number of things, Mr. Holt," she said steadily. "This is not among them. They took him through to Harker's Creek and then on to Abilene, where the legal proceedings would take place. Rebecca gave a formal written statement that same afternoon, sitting at Elias' office desk with Sheriff Briggs's deputy watching, writing out everything she knew in clear and organized prose. The deputy read it and raised his eyebrows slightly, and said she wrote better than most lawyers he had worked with, and she thanked him with the flat politeness of a woman who has heard such compliments, and found them somewhere between well-meant and insufficient. When the deputy was gone, and the immediate crisis had fully resolved itself into the bureaucratic aftermath that crises eventually become, there was a particular quality to the silence of the ranch that afternoon. The hands had gone back to work. Marta was in the kitchen. The sky was very blue and the air was cooling toward evening, and everything was completely ordinary in the specific way that ordinary feels after it has been threatened and held. Elias found her standing at the east fence, looking out over the pasture. He stood beside her for a while without speaking, which she had already learned was how he did things. He came to the right position first, and then he found the right words. "Where will you go?" he said finally. It was not what she had expected him to say, and it landed differently than she would have expected, with a quality of weight to it that suggested it was a harder question for him to ask than it sounded. "I had not fully thought about that," she said honestly. "I still have the $100. That changes the situation considerably from what it was a week ago." "It does," he said, a beat of silence. Marta has been asking me for a year to let her bring in help, he said. Someone to manage the correspondence and the household accounts. She manages the cooking and the domestic work, but the administrative side is not her inclination. Rebecca looked at him. It would be a formal position, he said. Wages, your own room, work that actually uses the capability you have. He was looking at the pasture, not at her, and she could see that careful control working hard. I am proposing it because it is a genuine need and you have demonstrated that you can do it and more. I want you to know that those are the reasons I am stating. Whatever else, he stopped. Whatever else is a separate matter. What is the whatever else, she said. Now he did look at her. The storm-gray eyes were not controlled at that moment. They were simply open, which was somehow more powerful than anything controlled could be. I think you know, he said. I would like you to say it, she said quietly. He turned toward her, and the late afternoon light fell across his face and the scarred hands and the torn shoulder of his shirt that Marta had not yet mended, and he said, I do not want you to go. That is the separate matter. I would like to know you better. I would like to have more conversations like the ones we have had in the past 2 days. I would like, he paused. I am not a man who finds this kind of thing easy to say. I know, she said. That is part of why it matters when you say it. He reached out very slowly. The way he had set the whiskey glass down that first evening, careful and deliberate, and took her hand. Just her hand, fingers closing over hers. It was the most careful and deliberate, and consequently the most moving gesture she could remember experiencing. Will you stay? He said. She looked at their joined hands and then up at his face, and she thought about every position she had ever held that was temporary by design. Every place she had been useful and then unnecessary. Every situation where she had been a means to someone else's end. She thought about $2 in a bar in Coldwater and a folded paper on a table and $100 in coin that had felt heavier than it should. She thought about a man who poured water for a dusty traveler and asked 3 questions and listened to the answers. Yes, she said, I will stay. The weeks that followed had the quality of something growing, not dramatically, not in the sudden explosive way of a crisis or a confrontation, but in the steady, daily way of something put in good soil and given time. Rebecca took on the administrative work of the ranch with a thoroughness that appeared to genuinely surprise Elias, though she noticed he was not a man who let himself stay surprised for long. Within 2 weeks, she had organized 3 months of backlogged correspondence, established a proper bookkeeping system in place of the irregular ledger entries that had been maintained previously, and written 2 letters on the ranch's behalf, one to a cattle buyer in Dallas who had been slow in his payments, and one to a legal firm in Abilene regarding the formal documentation of the water rights claim, which was now being pursued through proper channels in the aftermath of Holt's arrest. The legal firm wrote back expressing appreciation for the clarity and thoroughness of the communication. Elias read the letter twice and then handed it back to Rebecca without comment, except for a look that said everything the comment would have. Marta adopted her in the specific maternal way of a woman who recognizes competence and appreciates company. They cooked together in the evenings and talked in the way of women who have different experiences but similar practicality. And gradually Rebecca learned things about Elias from Marta that he would not have said himself. That he had built the water tower with his own hands the summer after his father died. That he had once ridden 40 miles through a winter storm to bring a doctor to a neighboring family's sick child. That he kept the books by Thoreau and 2 others on the shelf because they had been his mother's. And his mother had read them to him on winter evenings in Virginia before the family came west. She did not tell Marta that she was falling in love with him. She did not need to. Marta had eyes and a long experience of human nature, and she simply hummed to herself at the stove and said nothing, which was its own kind of understanding. Elias himself was not a man who rushed toward things, which Rebecca had known from the beginning. He was careful and deliberate in emotional matters, the way he was careful and deliberate in everything else, which she had come to understand was not coldness, but its opposite, a form of respect, a recognition that some things, once done, cannot be undone, and deserve therefore to be approached with full attention. He found her at the east fence again 3 weeks after the trouble with Holt. The sky was doing something magnificent with the evening light, spreading pink and gold over the entire west horizon, and she had stopped to watch it on her way back from checking the mail box at the end of the track, a task she had taken over from Tommy, who had too many other things to do and disliked the walk. "There is a letter from the Abilene firm," she said, holding it up. "Keep," he said, meaning she should open it and handle it, which she had already been doing for 2 weeks. He stood beside her and looked at the sky. "My father used to say Texas sunsets were God's way of apologizing for the summer heat," he said. "That is a very generous interpretation," she said. "He was a generous man." He paused. "You would have liked him. He also read Thoreau," she smiled. "It seems to run in the family." He looked sideways at her, and the almost smile that she had catalogued in her memory from their very first evening was there in full this time, a real smile, unhurried and genuine, and it changed his whole face in a way that made her chest do something unreasonable. "Rebecca," he said. "Yes. I want to say the rest of what I could not say 3 weeks ago." She turned to face him fully, the letter from Abilene forgotten in her hand. "I have not wanted to presume," he said carefully. "You came here in a complicated situation, and I am aware that I represent your current employment, and I did not want—" He stopped, reorganized. "I am trying very hard not to be the kind of man who takes advantage of a circumstance." "You are not," she said immediately. "You are precisely the opposite of that. I want to be certain. Elias." It was the first time she had used his given name without the formality, and she felt him register it, a small shift in his expression, a quality of attentiveness that was already at a high level increasing further. "I am not a woman who is easily confused about her own mind. I am telling you that whatever I feel about this situation is not the result of circumstance or dependency or gratitude for employment. Those things are real and I appreciate them. What I feel is separate from them, and I am clear about the difference." He was looking at her with that open, uncontrolled expression, the one she had seen at the fence the first time, that was more powerful than all his composure. "What do you feel?" he said. "I feel that you are the most genuinely decent person I have met in a very long time," she said. "I feel that talking to you is the most natural thing I have done in years. I feel that when you listened to me that first evening, I started trusting you before I fully understood that I was doing it, and everything since then has done nothing but confirm that the trust was correctly placed." She paused. "And I feel other things as well, which I am perfectly capable of stating directly, but which perhaps we can address in order." His mouth did the thing that was almost a smile, but fuller and warmer than that. "In order," he agreed. "Would it be acceptable to you if I—" He stopped again, and she thought she would remember for the rest of her life the particular quality of this man, choosing each word so carefully, as if words were things you could break if you held them wrong. "Yes," she said before he finished. "You do not know what I was going to say." "I know what you were going to ask," she said, "and the answer is yes." He reached up and touched her face with one rough hand, very gently, the way he did everything that he decided was worth doing carefully, and he kissed her in the light of the Texas sunset with the pink and gold still blazing across the whole wide sky, and it was the single most unhurried and deliberate, and consequently the most significant kiss Rebecca Bancroft had ever received in her 24 years of careful living. When they separated, his forehead rested against hers for a moment, and she could feel him breathing, and neither of them said anything, because some moments do not need words applied to them. Then the letter from Abilene crinkled in her hand, and she laughed, and he laughed, which was the first time she had heard him laugh fully, and it was a good sound, deep and surprised and completely genuine. "The legal correspondence," she said. "The legal correspondence," he agreed, and neither of them moved. The legal proceedings in Abilene consumed the better part of August and September. Gerald Holt faced charges related to conspiracy to commit arson and destruction of property, as well as fraud related to his land brokerage operation. Dix Barlow and Frank Sutter, and the third man, whose name was Cole Reeves, all cooperated with the prosecution to varying degrees in exchange for varying considerations. Rebecca made the journey to Abilene twice to give testimony, both times accompanied by Elias, who attended the legal proceedings with the same contained focus he brought to everything else, and who sat in the courtroom and listened to every word of every testimony with the particular attention of a man who has been wronged and intends to see the wrong correctly recorded. In the evenings in Abilene, away from the ranch and Marta and the familiar structure of their daily lives, they discovered other dimensions of each other. They walked in the evenings along the main street of Abilene, which in 1878 was a busier and considerably louder town than Harker's Creek, and they talked about books and about the law and about the West and about what the country was becoming, which was a topic Elias had strong opinions about. "It is becoming harder to hold things as they should be held," he said one evening, sitting with her in the small hotel dining room after a long day of proceedings. "The men who come after the land rights and the water rights and the mineral rights, they are not wrong that those things have value. They are wrong about what value means and how it should be pursued." "The law is supposed to mediate that," Rebecca said. "The law is only as good as the people who apply it," he said, "which is sometimes very good and sometimes very bad and usually somewhere in the middle." He looked at her. "You understand legal language and procedure better than most people who have not studied it. That is evident from the correspondence you have been writing." "My father believed in education," she said. "Your father was right." He said it with a definiteness that she had come to recognize as his way of ending an argument he considered already resolved. Then he added, more quietly, "There is a lawyer in Harker's Creek, name of Samuel Cross. He has mentioned to me several times that he needs a clerk, someone to manage his office correspondence and case documentation. I think he would find you exceptionally qualified." She looked at him across the table in the gaslit dining room of the Abilene Hotel. "Are you suggesting that I pursue a different position?" "I am suggesting that you pursue any position you are qualified for," he said, "including the one at the ranch, which I would very much prefer you to keep." He paused. "I am also suggesting that the ranch is not a sufficient use of what you have." The combination of what he was offering, the acknowledgement of her capability, the desire to keep her near, the absolute refusal to let one of those things come at the expense of the other, settled in Rebecca's chest with a warmth that was different from any warmth she had felt before, more permanent, more structural. "Let me finish the current casework," she said, "and then I would be glad to meet Mr. Cross." Elias nodded, as if this was the only sensible outcome and he had expected nothing else. Then he poured her more water and changed the subject to a book he had started reading on the journey up, and they talked about it for the rest of the evening. Holt was convicted in October, sentenced to 4 years in the state penitentiary. The 3 men who had carried out the physical attack on the ranch received shorter sentences in exchange for their testimony. The consortium's legal claims to the water rights adjacent to the Crossbar were formally dismissed by the court, and the water rights were officially recorded under Elias Easton's name in the county land office, which was exactly where they had always belonged. The afternoon Elias received the official documents confirming this. He sat at the desk in his office for a long time without doing anything else. Rebecca came in after a while and set a cup of coffee beside him and looked at the papers. "Your father's water," she said. "Yes," he said. Then he looked up at her and his eyes were not composed, not even slightly. "This ranch will be here in 50 years," he said. "There will be other people who try to take it before then, and they will not succeed either." "No," she agreed. "They will not." He reached up and took her hand and held it, and did not say anything further. And she stood there with his hand around hers and the official documents on the desk, and thought about the $100 in coin that had started all of this, and felt, with a clarity that was almost physical, exactly how far she had traveled from that. He asked her to marry him in November, standing in the kitchen doorway at 7 in the morning, which was not a romantic setting by conventional standards, but was, she thought, entirely characteristic of a man who did not perform gestures but simply acted when he had decided something was right. She had been making coffee. She turned around and he was standing there in his work clothes with his hat in his hand, which he almost never removed inside the house, and he said, "I would like to marry you, Rebecca, if you will have me." Not a speech, not a prepared declaration, just the thing itself offered directly. She looked at him for a long moment. At this man she had known for 4 months and felt she understood more completely than people she had known for years. At his rough hands and his steady eyes and his absolute refusal to be anything other than exactly what he was. "Yes," she said, "I will have you." He crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and held her face in both hands and kissed her with the same careful, deliberate, consuming quality that had characterized every significant thing he had ever done. And somewhere in the ranch house behind them, Marta, who had been listening from the dining room, made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a satisfied sigh, and then began to sing to herself, which was the most complete form of blessing Rebecca could have hoped for. They were married in December of 1878, in the Harker's Creek Church on a clear, cold morning with a sky so blue it looked painted. There were not many guests: Court and Abel and Tommy and the other ranch hands, Marta and her grown daughter who had come up from San Antonio for the occasion, Samuel Cross the lawyer and his wife, Sheriff Briggs and his deputy, and a handful of townspeople who had heard about the Crossbar affair, and were disposed to feel well toward a man who had defended his land and the woman who had helped him do it. Elias' sister Josephine had come up from San Antonio, and she had taken one look at Rebecca across the churchyard before the ceremony and said, with the directness that apparently ran in the family, "You are exactly the kind of person I hoped he would find. He told me about you in his letter, and I counted the days until this trip." Rebecca had liked her immediately, which was not a surprise. The ceremony was short and plain and honest, which was right for both of them. The minister read the words and they spoke their parts, and when it was done and they were standing together in the cold winter light outside the church, Elias took her hand in both of his and looked at her with an expression she had come to recognize as his form of complete openness. The face he showed only when the control was fully set aside, and there was nothing underneath it but the truth. "I did not think I would do this again," he said quietly, too low for anyone else to hear. "I know," she said. "I am glad I was wrong," he said. She squeezed his hand. "So am I." The winter on the Crossbar was her first winter there, and it was a revelation. She had expected the practical challenges, the cold, the isolation, the particular demands of a ranch in a season when the work changes but does not diminish, and they were real. What she had not expected was the intimacy of it. The long evenings by the fire with the wind outside, and the comfortable silence that was now not companionable restraint, but genuine ease. The mornings when she woke to find Elias already gone to the early work, and came downstairs to find a cup of coffee already poured on the stove for her, because he had learned within the first week of marriage that she needed coffee before she could properly face the morning, and had thereafter simply ensured it was there. Small things. The kind of small things that are larger than they appear, in the accumulation of daily life. She began working with Samuel Cross in the new year, 2 mornings per week initially, taking the horse and buggy into Harker's Creek and spending the morning organizing correspondence and case documentation, and occasionally sitting in on client meetings when Cross felt her perspective was useful, which was more often than she had expected. Cross was a small, precise man of about 50 with excellent judgment and the particular quality of integrity that comes from a lifetime of choosing the harder right over the easier wrong. He recognized her capability within the first month and raised her to 3 days per week and significantly increased her wages, and within 6 months he had begun referring to her contributions in ways that suggested she was less an employee than a collaborator. At home, Things were flourishing in multiple senses of the word. The ranch's operations expanded in the spring of 1879, when Elias negotiated a new arrangement with a cattle buyer in Fort Worth that significantly increased the Crossbar's revenue. Rebecca handled the contract documentation, working with Cross to ensure that the terms were favorable and legally sound, and Elias read through every page of it himself and asked good questions, and signed it with the confidence of a man who understood what he was agreeing to. Josephine visited again in May, bringing her husband Thomas and their 2 young children, and the ranch was briefly and delightfully chaotic in a way that it had not been before. Rebecca watched Elias with the children, his niece Clara and nephew James, and saw something in him that she recognized as a specific kind of happiness, one he had perhaps not expected to access again. The night after Josephine's family left, lying in the dark with the spring wind moving through the open window, she said to him quietly, "We should talk about children." He turned toward her in the dark, and she could feel his attention shift in the particular way it did when something mattered to him completely. "Yes," he said, "we should." "I want them," she said, "if you do." "I want them very much," he said, and the simplicity and directness of it, delivered in the dark to no one but her, was exactly the kind of thing that she had come to understand was the most reliable communication he was capable of, the things he said when there was no audience and no performance required. Their son was born in February of 1880, a long, difficult winter birth that Marta attended with absolute competence, and a midwife from Harker's Creek, who had been doing her work for 30 years and had, as she cheerfully told Rebecca during the hardest hours, seen everything that could possibly happen and managed it. When it was over and the child was placed in her arms, small and red-faced and furiously alive, announcing himself to the world with a series of opinions, Rebecca looked up at Elias, who had been allowed into the room by Marta's decree the moment the birth was complete, and who was standing at the bedside with an expression on his face that was unlike any she had ever seen there, stripped of everything except pure and undisguised wonder. "Hello," she said to the baby, in the somewhat dazed voice of someone who has just accomplished something enormous and is not yet fully certain of the dimensions of it. Elias sat on the edge of the bed very carefully and looked at the child in her arms. The rough hands that had built fence lines and fought men in the dark by a creek were tremendously gentle when they reached out and touched the top of his son's head. "William," Elias said. It had been the name they had agreed on after his father. "William," she confirmed. The child chose that moment to stop crying and open his eyes unfocused yet, the way newborn eyes are, not seeing anything clearly. And Elias Easton, who had controlled his expression through crises and grief and courtrooms and confrontations, looked at his son's face and did not control anything at all. Rebecca watched this happen and felt the fullness of it settle in every part of her, not just the love that was already so much a part of her daily experience that she sometimes forgot to name it, but something larger and more structural, the sense of a life that had found its correct form. William Easton was, from his earliest weeks, a person with decided opinions and considerable volume in the expression of them, which Marta said he inherited from his mother, and which Elias said was probably correct. He grew into a serious-faced baby, and then a curious toddler with his father's gray eyes, and his mother's tendency to watch everything carefully before deciding what to do about it. The Crossbar Ranch continued to grow and to hold its ground through the early 1880s, which were years of significant change in that part of Texas. The cattle trails were shifting as the railroad expanded. Land pressures were increasing as more settlers moved into the region. The legal landscape was becoming more complex, which kept Samuel Cross busy and kept Rebecca increasingly central to his practice. In the spring of 1882, Cross offered her a formal partnership, which was an unusual arrangement by the standards of the time, particularly for a woman, and which required some innovative thinking about how to structure it legally in a way that would be recognized and respected. They managed it, with considerable creativity and a certain amount of stubbornness on both their parts, and Rebecca Easton. She had been using both names professionally by this point, which Cross had supported without qualification, became the first formally recognized female legal partner in Harkers Creek County, which was a fact that the local paper covered in a brief article and which several people, including the county judge, found variously admirable and bewildering. Elias read the newspaper article at the breakfast table with William in his lap and a cup of coffee in his free hand and said, "I think your father would have been very proud." "I think so too," Rebecca said. "I know I am," he said, and looked at her over the newspaper with the gray eyes that she could still read perfectly after 4 years, which was the same thing as saying she could read them better now than she ever had before. Their second child came in 1883, a daughter they named Clara after Josephine's firstborn, a name Josephine received with considerable emotion when she was told. Clara was darker-haired than William and possessed of a particular quality of stillness that Rebecca recognized as Elias in concentrated form, and who at the age of 6 months was already watching the world with a seriousness that made Marta predict she would be a judge someday, which prediction Rebecca filed away with the satisfaction of someone who does not consider it impossible. Life on the Crossbar in 1884 was not simple. Nothing in the West in 1884 was simple. There were still land pressures and legal battles, and the occasional hard season when the rain didn't come enough or the cattle prices dropped. There were the broader injustices of the era that could not be fully escaped the treatment of the land's original inhabitants, the legal inequalities that Rebecca encountered daily in her practice and worked against where she could, the economic realities that pressed hardest on the people least equipped to bear them. But there was also this, a ranch that had been built by one man's hands and defended by two people's courage, and was now something larger than either of them alone. There was William Easton at 4 years old, racing Court's sheepdog across the front yard and informing anyone who would listen that he intended to be a rancher like his father or a lawyer like his mother, and had not yet decided which. There was Clara at 18 months, pulling herself upright against the porch railing and surveying the yard with an expression of intelligent evaluation. There was Marta humming in the kitchen, and Abel exercising the horses in the morning, and the cottonwoods along the creek going gold in the fall light. There was Elias at the end of each day, sitting in the chair by the fire that had been his father's chair and was now his, reading whatever he was reading or not reading, but just being there, present and quiet and entirely himself, and looking up when she came into the room with the expression that she had first seen stripped bare on the edge of the bed when William was born, that unguarded, undisguised openness that he offered to no one else in the world, but to her as completely and consistently as the land offered the sky. One evening in October of 1884, she sat beside him in her own chair and he set down his book and she set down the Cross and Easton firm correspondence she had been reviewing, and they sat for a while in the firelight listening to the wind off the plains and the distant cattle and the sound of their children breathing in the rooms above them. "I keep thinking about the first evening," she said, "when I walked in here and told you everything." "So do I," he said. "I was terrified," she said. "Not of you. Of being wrong about you, about what you would do with the information." "Were you wrong?" he said. "No," she said, "not even slightly." He reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand, the same way he had taken her hand at the east fence that first evening and held it. "I think about what would have happened if you had not told me," he said, "and I find that I cannot sustain the thought very long." "Because of the ranch," she said. "No," he said, "because then we would not have had this." She held his hand and looked at the fire, and outside the wind moved across the Texas plain in the same way it had moved for centuries before either of them existed and would move for centuries after, and the fire was warm and the house was solid, and everything that mattered was exactly where it was supposed to be. She thought about Gerald Holt in his prison cell in Abilene. She thought about the $100 in coin and the folded paper on the table in Old Pete's bar. She thought about the dried-up settlement and the seamstress in Amarillo and every temporary position she had ever held that had ended when she was no longer needed. She thought about a man who poured water for a stranger and asked 3 questions and listened to every answer, and how that one uncomplicated act of human decency had changed the entire direction of her life. "Elias," she said. "Yes, I want to tell you something." He turned to look at her, and the fire made shadows move across his face, and the gray eyes were exactly as she had first seen them, watchful and careful, and beneath that, genuinely open to whatever she was about to say. "You are the best decision I ever made," she said. "Not because of the ranch or the children or the work or any of the practical good of it. Because of you specifically. Because of who you are." He was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he was receiving what she had said fully, not rushing to respond. Then he said, "You are the best thing that has ever happened to me, and I include the things I built and the things I defended and the things I am proud of. You are better than all of them." She leaned over and kissed him, right there in the firelight with the wind outside and the house full of the breathing of their children, and he kissed her back with that same unhurried, deliberate quality, as if this was a thing worth doing properly, which it was. Afterward she settled her head against his shoulder, and he kept her hand, and they sat there quietly, until the fire burned lower and they needed to put another log on. And then they did that practical thing and came back to their chairs, and talked for a while about William's apparent determination to befriend every animal on the property and Clara's opinions about breakfast. And then about a case Samuel Cross had described that week and Elias' thoughts on the water rights law changing at the state level. And then about whether the cottonwoods needed pruning before winter. All the ordinary things. All the things that are the substance of a life actually being lived. The lamp burned and the fire crackled, and the night settled over the Crossbar Ranch, over the solid fence lines and the good water tower and the straight track up from the road, over the barn and the bunkhouse where Court and Abel and Tommy, older now, all of them, grown into the place, were bedded down for the night, over the east pasture and the creek and the cottonwoods in the southwest corner, where the water rights document was filed in the county ledger under the name Easton, properly and permanently, the way a true thing should be recorded. And in the morning, the sun would come up over the plains the way it had always come up, indifferent and magnificent, and everything that mattered would still be standing in its light. Rebecca Bancroft had come to the Crossbar Ranch in the summer of 1878 with a lie sewn into her cover story and the seeds of an honest decision already germinating inside her, sent to distract a man who deserved better, and she had warned him instead. She had not saved him. That was an important distinction, and she would have insisted on it if anyone had tried to frame it that way. Elias Easton had handled his own defense with more capability than any single person's warning had been required to supply. He had been prepared and competent and clear-headed, and he had had good people around him. What she had given him was the chance to use those things. What he had given her was everything. And the water still ran in the creek along the cottonwoods, and the land was held, and the house was full of warmth and children and books, and the particular sound of 2 people who have found the right person and know it, living their lives in the full and unhurried way of people who do not expect the good things to be taken from them, because they have built them right and defended them true, and intend to keep doing exactly that for as long as there is land and light in each other. Which, in their intentions, if not in anyone's power to guarantee, was going to be a very long time indeed.